My name is Jonah Holt, and I am 38 years old. You are just a pair of hands to wipe the counters, Arthur Merrick told me every single morning for 7 long years. I kept the receipt for the safety deposit box tucked behind the calendar. Arthur ran the clinic like a ledger where living people were reduced to debit columns. Thomas Voss leaned against the doorframe and watched the rain streak down the frosted window panes. Nobody ever looks at the bottom of the care log unless they are searching for someone to blame for a mistake. Coldwater was a town built on quiet glances and signed agreements. Arthur believed his authority was absolute because his name sat at the top of every printed page. He signed his letters with a heavy gold pen that clicked against the mahogany desktop. I wiped the stainless steel counters until they shone under the harsh morning lights of the room. Nobody ever questions the quiet daily routines of a tired hospital nurse who stays too late to finish his paperwork. The system hummed along without a single complaint from the people who mattered least, until the day the balance finally shifted. Stay for what comes next. Subscribe to see what was inside that safety deposit box. This is a patient story of numbers and ink, not a loud confrontation. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Coldwater winters are long. The clinic kept its secrets behind locked doors and careful ledgers. Arthur thought the records were safe under his heavy gold pen. He was wrong. Every line eventually balances out. You will want to stay for the rest of it. I woke before dawn in Coldwater. The morning shift always started promptly at 6. My coffee was black and bitter. I walked down Old Maple Street while the early morning frost still clung tightly to the cold asphalt pavement outside. Nursing taught me a specific way of seeing the world. Every shift required precise documentation. A missing chart meant a broken chain. I always checked the daily care log very carefully before touching any medication stored safely inside the secure clinic room. The pages held a quiet accountability. Thomas often stood by the doorway watching quietly. Arthur signed the top pages with heavy strokes from his pen. Nothing felt out of place. We all genuinely believed the entire administrative system worked properly because the numbers balanced neatly at the end of every single day. Habits formed very slowly over the course of many years while working long shifts inside the small medical clinic downtown. Ink dried on paper. Time moved forward without any sudden interruption. I trusted the process completely. Arthur believed in certain principles. The Merrick household operated under an unwritten code that governed every single transaction across the decades. In the Merrick household, what was signed away by a tired hand in a private office was treated as freely given. The records left in the cabinet were treated as invisible by everyone involved. This philosophy defined how the clinic functioned every single day under his watchful eye. Arthur repeated variations of this belief whenever a junior staff member questioned an incoming invoice. The paperwork on the mahogany desk always carried more weight than any verbal agreement made in the hallway. Everyone accepted this dynamic without offering a single word of public complaint. Thomas stood by the doorway while Arthur explained the ledger entries to the new hires. He nodded along with every single word the older man spoke. Thomas understood the unwritten rules better than most people in Coldwater. He had watched 3 different nurses leave the clinic after asking too many questions about the filing system. The wooden filing cabinet remained locked during the daytime hours. Arthur kept the heavy brass key inside his pocket right next to his gold pen. Nobody dared to ask for access to the bottom drawer where the older records sat gathering dust. The staff preferred to look away rather than test the boundaries of the household code. Silence kept the peace in a facility built on quiet compliance. I cleaned the stainless steel counters while listening to their quiet conversations. My own perspective on the clinic records differed entirely from the family philosophy. A signature on a hurried document did not erase the physical reality of the supplies moving through the rooms. Arthur relied on the assumption that nobody checked the underlying math. He trusted the absolute authority of his own handwriting at the top of every page. That unwavering confidence formed the foundation of his entire administrative routine. The daily logs remained neat and orderly on the surface of the desk. Beneath that neat exterior, tiny discrepancies accumulated week after week without drawing any attention. Coldwater was a quiet town where people rarely questioned local authority figures. Arthur carried himself with the heavy assurance of a man who owned the building and the business. His family name opened doors across the entire county without requiring any explanation. People assumed the clinic operated with flawless precision because the waiting room always smelled like fresh bleach and coffee. Nobody imagined that a simple filing cabinet could hold the key to an entire system of quiet overreach. The unspoken rule protected the family from external scrutiny for many years. Every employee learned to nod and look at the floor when Arthur walked down the narrow hallway. The afternoon light filtered through the clinic windows and hit the polished wooden floorboards. I placed the empty medication trays back into the wall cabinet with deliberate slowness. Thomas leaned against the door frame and watched my hands move across the metal surface. He looked tired after managing the morning appointments alone. Neither of us mentioned the ledger sitting open in the administrative office behind us. Arthur was already walking toward the exit with his heavy wool coat over his arm. The routine continued exactly as it had for the past 7 years without a single interruption. The household rule held firm against the quiet pressure of daily reality. Arthur stepped into the small supply room. His gray wool coat smelled faintly of rain and old cedar. Thomas followed right behind him, carrying the blue binder under one arm. Arthur stood by the gray metal shelving unit, while Thomas waited quietly near the narrow doorway, holding the heavy blue binder. He tapped the top shelf with his signet ring. That ring had belonged to his father before the practice moved to Maple Street. Thomas shifted from his left foot to his right foot. He looked down at the linoleum floor. Some discrepancies are just bad handwriting if you choose not to look twice, Thomas muttered under his breath. Arthur did not react to the remark at all. He pulled a heavy brass key from his trousers and laid it flat on the counter next to the plastic bins. I wiped the white laminate surface with a disinfectant wipe. My hand did not shake. The silence in the small room stretched thin between us. Arthur wanted the inventory counts finished before the afternoon clinic hours began. Thomas placed the blue binder on the counter. The metal ring binder made a sharp click against the laminate. Arthur opened the front cover with his thumb. He flipped through the pages until he reached the section on controlled substances. 700 dosages of routine medication had been logged that month. The numbers were neat and orderly down every single column. Thomas cleared his throat loudly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. The corner of the envelope showed old letters from his father bundled with a rubber band. He shoved the bundle back into his pocket without looking at us. Arthur ignored the movement entirely. He pointed his gold pen at the bottom row of the inventory sheet. "We must verify every entry before the evening shift arrives," Arthur said quietly. I nodded once. I kept my gaze fixed on the paper. The safety deposit box receipt remained hidden securely behind the wall calendar in the small kitchen back at my house. The office remained quiet for a long moment. Arthur adjusted his cuffs. The gold links caught the fluorescent light overhead. Thomas stared at the floor tiles again. He rubbed the back of his neck with a cold hand. I picked up my pen to sign the bottom margin of the daily register. Arthur watched my hand move across the paper. "You spend too much time checking the margins," Arthur said. His voice carried no warmth at all. I did not look up from the page. The care logs demanded absolute precision from every single nurse on staff. Thomas let out a soft sigh and leaned against the painted wall. He looked tired and older than his 39 years. The heavy weight of the demanding daily clinic routine pressed down on both of us in very different and difficult ways. Arthur turned on his heel and walked out toward the front desk. Thomas lingered in the doorway for another minute. He did not say anything else before following him down the narrow hallway. I stayed behind in the supply room. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the harsh lights. I checked the small padlock on the storage cabinet. Everything was locked tight. The day stretched ahead with its endless sequence of routine tasks and patient charts. I picked up the blue binder. The paper felt crisp beneath my fingers. Arthur left his brass key resting on the laminate edge. I did not touch it. I walked over to the sink and washed my hands thoroughly. Water ran cold over my skin. The busy medical clinic would run its usual course until the very end of the long afternoon shift without major interruptions. The mahogany desk caught the late afternoon glare from the window. Arthur sat behind it with his heavy gold pen resting across a pile of clipped invoices. Thomas stood by the door, his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. "You missed a shift entry on the Tuesday log," Arthur said without looking up from the paper. I stood on the other side of the polished wood surface and waited for him to turn the heavy page. I checked every chart twice before filing it, I said, keeping my voice entirely even and controlled. Arthur leaned back and let the heavy pen drop against the dark leather blotter. He picked up the blue binder that held the monthly care logs for the clinic. "We do not pay you to guess at numbers around here," Thomas muttered from his corner by the coat rack. The silence in the small room grew heavy and thick. I looked down at the margin, where my initials sat beside the printed times. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does, I thought to myself, watching the gold pen tap twice against the leather. Arthur pushed the open binder forward with a single firm finger across the polished wood. He pointed directly to a blank line in the middle of the afternoon column, where a routine entry should have been recorded. You left this space empty for 40 minutes, Arthur said, his tone entirely flat and administrative. I reached across the corner of the desk to point at the corresponding digital monitor printout. The machine recorded the patient transfer right at that exact timestamp, I said quietly. Arthur simply shook his head and closed the heavy binder with a sharp slap against the laminate surface. Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other against the green-painted wall. He did not look at me, while Arthur continued his quiet lecture on clinic protocol and basic competence. "You are slipping lately, Jonah," Arthur said, using that cold professional voice that completely flattened any argument I tried to make before him. I kept my hands flat against my thighs and said nothing more to defend myself. The reprimand was designed to stay on the permanent personnel record without ever leaving a physical mark that anyone could trace later. Every nurse in the building understood precisely what that margin note meant for their standing within the busy medical facility. It signaled a permanent shift in how the administration viewed your daily reliability. Arthur stood up from his mahogany chair and straightened his cuffs before walking toward the supply closet door. Thomas followed closely behind him like a shadow in the dim hallway. I remained standing by the desk for a long moment while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the quiet room. Arthur picked up his heavy gold pen once more and drew a sharp red line across the bottom of the page. That margin note would stay in the personnel files downstairs for as long as the clinic remained open. I nodded slowly and turned toward the exit. Thomas stepped aside to let me pass through the narrow doorway into the hallway. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic soap and old paper as I walked back toward the break room. Back in the small locker area, I pulled my heavy winter jacket from the metal hook fastened to the wall. My fingers brushed against the safety deposit box receipt hidden quietly behind the calendar frame. Arthur still held the brass key to the filing cabinet in his vest pocket. He believed his entire system was airtight and completely beyond question. I zipped my jacket up to the chin and walked out into the cold evening air without looking back. The 6 a.m. shift bell sounded hollow against the linoleum. I hung my jacket on the bottom hook by the door. Thomas walked past with a clipboard in his hand. He looked down quickly at his scuffed boots. Arthur stayed inside his private glass office all morning. The heavy mahogany door remained shut tight against the corridor noise. I pulled my shifts and walked home by 4 every afternoon. No extra hours were requested on my schedule anymore. No weekend coverage crossed my wooden desk. The clinic ledger stayed balanced neatly under my working hands. I filled out every single line with exact care. Nobody thanked me for the quiet precision. The routine felt hollow. Back at my apartment, the wall calendar hid a small metal key. I walked down to the local bank on 4th Street. The steel vault door swung open with a heavy mechanical click. Inside that quiet alcove, I placed the first duplicate care log sheet. The safety deposit box felt cold against my palm. I checked the lock twice before turning away. More papers followed over the course of the following weeks. A copy of the supply inventory went into the metal drawer. A signed shift roster joined it on a Tuesday afternoon. Each document recorded a small truth from the building downtown. I locked the box and pocketed the brass key carefully. Arthur noticed the slight shift in my daily posture. He tapped his heavy gold pen against the leather blotter. "Is something bothering you about the files?" he asked quietly. I shook my head and kept my eyes on the paperwork. "Everything is accounted for," I said. He watched me for a long moment. Thomas stood by the water cooler and watched the hallway closely. He held a manila folder against his chest like a shield. His fingers drummed against the stiff cardboard edge. He did not speak to me about the missing hours anymore. The silence between us grew wide and permanent. The metal box inside the bank vault slowly gathered physical weight. I kept duplicate records of every single drug count. 700 dosages were checked and rechecked on crisp paper. Every number matched the official clinic file stored downtown. The copies sat safely in the dark behind the brass tumbler. No one else knew the box existed. Nursing taught me to trust the paper trail above all else. Ink does not panic under sudden pressure. Timestamps reveal exactly who stood in the room. I stacked the receipts by date inside the metal container. The cold steel protected every single page from accidental loss or ruin. Arthur walked past my nursing station with his coat over his arm. He paused near the counter for a brief second. "Your handwriting is remarkably consistent across these pages," he said. I nodded and closed the blue binder. "Thank you," I said simply. I gathered my canvas bag and walked out the glass doors. The evening air carried the sharp smell of damp pine needles. Coldwater was quiet under the gathering dusk. Streetlights flickered on along Maple Street. My boots crunched steadily against the gravel pathway. The shadows stretched long across the empty pavement. I made a deliberate detour before going home for the night. The bank lobby smelled of polished wood and old paper. The teller nodded politely as I approached the counter. I signed my name in the heavy registry book. The vault door closed with a solid thud behind me. The silence inside the alcove was absolute. Inside the small booth, I slid the new shift logs into the metal container. The stack of papers grew thicker with each passing week. None of these records belonged to me by any legal right. They simply documented what the clinic floor produced every day. Withdrawal looks like total compliance from a distance. I smiled at the staff and answered every question promptly. I did not raise my voice or object to the new rules. The real work happened away from the mahogany desk. The safety deposit box held the quiet proof. I locked the metal drawer and handed the key back to the attendant. Walking back out into the street felt remarkably light. The town continued its slow evening routine without a single interruption. I walked toward home and locked the wooden door behind me. The night was entirely still. You are still here with me in Coldwater. Have you ever stayed silent while someone you trusted built a slow trap around your livelihood? I kept my head down and watched the ledgers stack up day after day. Arthur thought his system was entirely airtight and immune to any oversight. He assumed the paperwork would protect him when the office doors finally locked for good. But every ledger eventually reached its final page, and the ink we dried today would speak when tomorrow arrived here. Over 7 years in Coldwater, the seasons changed outside the clinic windows with reliable monotony. Winter frost gave way to damp spring mornings. I stood by the front counter every single day. The routine remained identical. Arthur walked past my station at 8 in the morning, carrying his heavy gold pen in his pocket. Every single shift brought fresh documentation that demanded absolute precision and careful filing into the locked wooden cabinet by the window. The blue binder sat on the shelf. I reached for it when the hallway emptied out. 700 dosages were accounted for in the monthly inventory log. Thomas watched from the doorway without speaking a single word. His hands stayed buried inside his pockets. I pulled my blue ink pen across the paper lines. My handwriting remained steady and completely legible. Every single handwritten entry matched the previous week's official records with a quiet exactness that left absolutely no room for error anywhere. Nights at home followed a similar pattern. The safety deposit box receipt stayed hidden behind the calendar on the kitchen wall. I opened the small metal container under the desk lamp. Duplicate invoices and signed shift rosters filled the interior space. Paper accumulated in neat stacks week after week. Nobody else knew what those folders contained. The discipline of the profession became a private shield against uncertainty. I turned the pages slowly under the yellow light. The local bank on 4th Street opened at 9 every morning. I walked past the teller window with a standard manila envelope tucked under my arm. The clerk nodded without looking up from her terminal. I unlocked box number 42 in the basement vault. Another carbon copy joined the growing archive inside the metal drawer. These records did not shout or demand attention. They simply waited in the dim vault air for the right moment to surface. Back at the clinic, Arthur reviewed the daily tallies at his mahogany desk. He signed his name with a flourish of his expensive pen. He never looked twice at the duplicate copies resting safely across town. Thomas leaned against the supply room doorframe and watched us both. We exchanged no greetings as he turned away down the corridor. The silence between us stretched across the months like a physical barrier. My hands kept moving across the ledgers, logging every detail with meticulous care. Time moved forward without dramatic interruptions. Patient charts filled the wooden drawers to capacity. Inventory counts balanced to the exact decimal point on every single page. The habit of keeping records turned into an invisible armor that protected my position. Arthur believed his administrative domain was completely untouchable. My duplicate files grew thicker with each passing season. Over 7 long years, the heavy wooden filing cabinets filled up completely with carbon copies. I kept every single shift roster locked away securely. Arthur walked past my desk every morning without a single pause. He trusted his heavy gold pen implicitly. The administrative routine stayed entirely unchanged through every single season that passed outside the cold clinic windows. Thomas stood near the supply room door during the quiet afternoons. He watched my hands move across the blue binder pages. Neither of us spoke a word about the growing stacks. The ledger pages absorbed every stroke of my blue ink pen. The quiet weight of our shared silence settled heavily over the white linoleum floor every single afternoon. 4th Street remained quiet on early winter mornings. I walked down the sidewalk with a standard manila envelope tucked tightly beneath my arm. The bank teller nodded politely as I approached her window. Box number 42 waited in the concrete vault downstairs. The heavy metal door swung open smoothly to reveal rows of small locked compartments waiting in the dim fluorescent light. Inside the small booth, I slid the newest duplicate sheets into the metal drawer. The paper stacks were reaching the top edge of the container now. 700 dosages were meticulously tracked across those hidden pages. Arthur had no idea what accumulated in the basement vault while he signed checks upstairs. Every record stayed exact and unassailable. Back at the clinic, the fluorescent lights hummed above the stainless steel counters. I wiped the surfaces clean before the afternoon shift began. Arthur reviewed the supply invoices at his mahogany desk with total confidence. His world was built on the assumption that nothing could ever disturb his ledgers. Thomas watched him from the hallway with empty eyes. Winter frost slowly turned into damp spring mud on Maple Street. The patients came and went with predictable regularity. I handed out prescription refills according to the strict schedule. Every timestamp matched the official computer entries without a single discrepancy. My penmanship remained identical on every duplicate sheet. The habit of keeping records became a private discipline that required no external validation. I did not need to shout or demand compliance from anyone in the building. The documents spoke entirely for themselves when placed side by side. Arthur signed the top pages of the monthly tallies without looking closer. His carelessness was a predictable constant. Years slipped past in a blur of identical Tuesdays and Fridays. The pile of receipts behind the kitchen calendar grew thicker with each passing month. I opened the small metal box at the kitchen table under the warm desk lamp. The past 7 years rested entirely within those folded manila folders. Nothing was missing from the inventory. Coldwater offered few surprises for people who kept their heads down. The medical clinic ran like clockwork under Arthur's strict administrative oversight. Nobody questioned the man who held the heavy brass key in his pocket. The duplicate files waited patiently across town for the appointed hour. The system he designed would eventually consume him entirely. I closed the desk drawer and locked it with a small brass key. The morning sun began to climb over the downtown rooftops. It was nearly time to walk back down Maple Street for the 6 a.m. shift. The daily ledgers were waiting on the counter. The quiet discipline of the profession remained my only shield. The routine offered absolute comfort in an unpredictable world. Every single patient chart found its proper place in the heavy wooden drawer. The wooden floors in the clinic creaked beneath my boots. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk with the ledger open. He adjusted his heavy reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. His hands shook slightly against the stiff paper pages. Arthur reached for his coffee cup and found it completely empty. He rubbed his tired eyes with the back of a worn thumb. For a fleeting second, he looked entirely human and profoundly old. The imposing boss of Coldwater looked like a man who simply could not see the page anymore. He set the gold pen down on the dark wood surface. "This ink is fading faster than it used to," he muttered quietly to the empty room. I stood by the stainless steel counter and watched him struggle. The family rules required absolute perfection from every single staff member on duty. Yet the aging man at the desk was missing lines he had written himself hours ago. Some discrepancies are just bad handwriting if you choose not to look twice. That old phrase echoed softly in my mind while I checked the supply shelves. Arthur turned a page and paused over an entry from the previous Tuesday. His brow furrowed deeply as he tried to decipher his own hurried script. The ledger had carried 700 dosages that month without a single visible correction, but the margins were starting to fray under the pressure of too many quiet omissions. Thomas walked into the small administrative office, carrying a stack of wrinkled receipts. He placed the papers beside the blue binder without making eye contact with either of us. "You forgot to sign the bottom docket before lunch," Thomas said flatly. Arthur blinked against the glare of the desk lamp and cleared his throat. "I must have missed that line during the morning rush," Arthur admitted with unusual hesitation. His voice lacked the rigid certainty that usually filled the medical rooms. The unwritten family laws of the clinic relied entirely on absolute unquestioned authority. When the man at the top started missing his own entries, the foundation began to slip. I wiped the metal surface down with a clean white cloth. Every movement remained slow and deliberate while the tension in the room grew thicker. The duplicate records sat safely across town inside the secure 4th Street Bank booth. Arthur closed the heavy ledger with a dull thud that echoed off the white walls. "We need to audit the remaining supply inventories before the end of the business week," Arthur said. I nodded slowly without offering any unnecessary words or defensive explanations about the workflow. Thomas lingered near the doorway like a ghost who had lost his purpose in the hallway. The strict hierarchy of the building was fracturing from its own internal weight and exhaustion. No one shouted or raised their voice above the normal conversational volume of a clinic. The mistakes were piling up in plain sight for anyone willing to inspect the margins. Arthur stared down at the blank space at the bottom of the current shift report. He picked up his heavy gold pen again and held it motionless above the paper. The ink stayed trapped inside the barrel because nothing more needed to be written down right then. Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does, I reminded myself silently. The care log pages turned forward toward an ending that neither Arthur nor Thomas could prevent now. I gathered my canvas bag from the hook behind the door and prepared to leave. The street outside was quiet as the evening shadows stretched across the pavement of Maple Street. Have you ever watched someone sign their own name to a mistake? It happens every day in quiet medical offices across the town. You stand quietly by the clinic door. You hold your tongue and watch. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk for years, believing his heavy gold pen protected every single line he drew across the ledger. Did you wait patiently for a balance sheet to finally catch up with someone who thought rules applied only to other people? The final numbers always tell. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk. He reached for his heavy gold pen. He drafted a formal memo to protect his clinic from recent audits. He wrote every sentence with total confidence in his own authority. This notarized statement was meant to silence any lingering questions about the ledger. Arthur handed the paper directly to Thomas before morning rounds began. Arthur firmly believed that putting his absolute defense in formal writing would secure his position against any future administrative challenges. Thomas brought the signed document into the supply room and placed it on the stainless steel counter. He looked tired and avoided my eyes completely. I picked up the notarized statement and read the text line by line. Arthur had signed his name with a heavy flourish at the bottom. He admitted explicitly to altering the supply orders himself. He thought minor errors would simply look like bad penmanship to an outside reviewer. I carefully examined every single word of the confession because the physical evidence matched the hidden file in my box. "This paper changes everything we discussed," Thomas said quietly while standing by the doorway. I folded the notarized statement and placed it inside my pocket. Arthur signed his own name to the error without realizing the full weight of the paper. I watched the second hand move slowly across the wall clock. Medical charts never lied about the hours or the numbers. Thomas stood near the counter for a long moment before he finally decided to walk back out toward the hallway. "You should not have let him sign that confession," I said to Thomas without raising my voice. Thomas shook his head and gripped the edge of the blue binder tightly. "Arthur never listens to anyone once he makes up his mind about the paperwork," he said before turning away. The written overreach sat securely inside my canvas bag. Every single page of the formal declaration contained enough administrative proof to dismantle the entire operation in cold water. "I have the bank receipt and the duplicate logs ready for the investigator," I told the empty room. The mahogany desk in the main office remained empty while Arthur took his mid-morning break. I walked past the open doorway and kept my pace steady. The record type I kept for 7 years finally had its undeniable match in ink. Arthur had absolutely no idea that his own signature would become the exact instrument of his professional undoing. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the linoleum floor of the medical clinic. I washed my hands at the sink and dried them on a clean paper towel. Arthur emerged from his private office holding a stack of yellow invoices. He dropped them on the front desk with a heavy thud. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat loudly. Arthur looked completely composed while standing in the center of the hallway where he had ruled for 7 years. "Is everything in order for the afternoon shift?" Arthur asked while checking his gold pocket watch. "Everything is balanced," I replied, keeping my tone entirely neutral and calm. He nodded once and walked back toward his mahogany desk. The signed statement rested safely inside my canvas bag in the locker room. I watched him cross the quiet room completely unaware that his own written words had sealed his fate forever. Coldwater offered very few genuine surprises during my years at the downtown clinic. People trusted the established routines and the familiar faces behind the counter. Arthur banked entirely on that quiet local trust to protect his administration. He assumed no one would ever question a notarized statement bearing his own official seal. That written arrogance formed the final boundary of his oversight. The physical records resting inside my safety deposit box at the bank on 4th Street required no extra explanation. Thomas remained near the front entrance, watching the empty waiting room chairs. He knew the contents of the blue binder as well as I did. He understood the legal weight of Arthur's signed admission. The paper trail now connected every missing entry directly to the director's desk. Thomas finally understood that silence could no longer ever protect anyone from the consequences of such careless administrative fraud. I finished my tasks and closed the supply room door with a soft click. The evening shift would arrive soon to take over the charts. I gathered my coat from the small metal locker. The heavy brass key remained inside Arthur's office drawer, where it always stayed. I stepped out into the very crisp evening air, carrying the only piece of evidence that truly mattered. The kitchen table in my apartment was small and made of oak. I cleared away the coffee mug and the stack of old newspapers. The surface needed to be entirely clean before the files came out. Arthur sat across from me without his usual coat. He placed his heavy hands flat on the scarred wood while the afternoon light faded outside. Thomas stepped through the open door a moment later with a quiet knock. He carried a worn manila folder under his arm instead of the usual clinic ledgers. The blue binding of the monthly records sat between us like an unexploded engine part waiting for a spark. Thomas placed his father letters beside the stack because the past demanded a proper accounting. I opened the cardboard folder and slid the duplicate sheets across the wooden grain toward Arthur. Every shift log and inventory count was accounted for down to the last signature. Arthur stared down at the paper with tired eyes that refused to focus on the small details. I watched his fingers twitch against the edge of the laminate surface. "You brought the wrong box into this room," Arthur said quietly. I shook my head and reached for the topmost page of the duplicate records. The numbers on the page did not bend just because an administrator wished them to look different. "Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does," I said. Thomas nodded slowly from the corner near the stove. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He laid it flat beside the bank receipts without looking at either of us. "This is the missing manifest from the supply room," Thomas said. He did not say much else, but his hands stayed steady as he stepped back toward the wall. The kitchen felt smaller with the entire archive laid out under the hanging lamp. Arthur reached for his pocket, as if looking for the heavy gold pen he had used for 7 years. The pen was gone, left behind on the clinic counter hours ago. The silence in the small apartment stretched out across the room. The kitchen table in my apartment was small and made of oak. I cleared away the coffee mug and the stack of old newspapers. The surface needed to be entirely clean before the files came out. Arthur sat across from me without his usual coat. He placed his heavy hands flat on the scarred wood while the afternoon light faded outside. Thomas stepped through the open door a moment later with a quiet knock. He carried a worn manila folder under his arm instead of the usual clinic ledgers. The blue binding of the monthly records sat between us like an unexploded engine part waiting for a spark. Thomas placed his father letters beside the stack because the past demanded a proper accounting. I opened the cardboard folder and slid the duplicate sheets across the wooden grain toward Arthur. Every shift log and inventory count was accounted for down to the last signature. Arthur stared down at the paper with tired eyes that refused to focus on the small details. I watched his fingers twitch against the edge of the laminate surface. "You brought the wrong box into this room," Arthur said quietly. I shook my head and reached for the topmost page of the duplicate records. The numbers on the page did not bend just because an administrator wished them to look different. "Vitals and timestamps tell the truth before anyone in the room does," I said. Thomas nodded slowly from the corner near the stove. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He laid it flat beside the bank receipts without looking at either of us. "This is the missing manifest from the supply room," Thomas said. He did not say much else, but his hands stayed steady as he stepped back toward the wall. The kitchen felt smaller with the entire archive laid out under the hanging lamp. Arthur reached for his pocket as if looking for the heavy gold pen he had used for 7 years. The pen was gone, left behind on the clinic counter hours ago. The silence in the small apartment stretched out across the room. Thomas placed his weathered leather binder next to the stack of invoices. The paper smelled like old basements and printer toner. He laid the packet of his father letters on top of the pile. Those letters had stayed hidden inside a desk drawer for decades before today. Thomas cleared his throat and stared at the floorboards instead of meeting our eyes. "My father left these instructions long before the clinic doors ever opened on Maple Street," Thomas said. His voice was barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. The faded ink on those old pages proved that administrative neglect had been standard practice long before Arthur ever took over. Arthur adjusted his collar with a trembling hand. The gold pen was gone, but the habit of authority lingered in his posture. He touched the corner of the safety deposit box receipt with a dirty fingernail. 700 routine medication dosages were itemized on the page beneath his thumb. Arthur finally understood that his entire administrative career rested entirely on fragile paper documents he could no longer control or alter. "This paperwork cannot undo 20 years of service," Arthur said hoarsely. I did not answer him with anger or satisfaction. Thomas stepped back toward the door without asking for permission to leave. He had done what was necessary to clear his own conscience. The duplicate records remained spread across the oak surface in neat piles. Nothing more needed to be destroyed or hidden away in a bank booth. I closed the cardboard folder and slid it toward the edge of the table. "You should take these files with you when you walk out those doors," I said. The afternoon shadows stretched across the floor as the older man gathered his coat and stepped out into the cold air. The small brass key sat alone on my wooden table. 412 remained locked at the downtown bank. 600 pages of exact carbon copies waited inside that metal box. Every single shift log and medication count rested quietly in the dark. I could have mailed the entire packet to the state board. I could have copied the investigators on every discrepancy. I chose to leave the envelopes untouched in the drawer. Revenge demands a constant devotion that I simply refused to give. You spend years keeping track of every error, and then the moment arrives to strike, and you find the anger has completely burned out. The 700 missing dosages belonged to a system that was already collapsing under its own weight. Arthur was an old man sitting in an empty house. Destroying him further would not bring back the quiet dignity of a properly run clinic. I picked up the brass key and dropped it into a coffee mug by the sink. Thomas called me just after 9 o'clock. "Are the papers on their way to the authorities?" he asked me quietly. I told him they were staying right where they were. He exhaled a long breath through the telephone line. "I am glad you stopped," he said before he disconnected. I strolled across to the front window. The streetlights flickered against the damp pavement of Maple Street. My hands felt light and empty. No more blue binders needed auditing. No more 40-minute gaps required defending. The care logs were history now, closed and filed away forever. I sat down in the wooden chair. The stillness within the space carried an entirely unfamiliar atmosphere compared to before. It was not the quiet of tension or fear. It was simply the quiet of a shift that had finally ended. I reached out and turned off the kitchen lamp. Sleep came easily for the first time in 7 years. The clinic opened its doors on Monday morning without any shouting. I wiped the metal counter using fresh disinfectant. Thomas stood by the side entrance holding a cardboard box. He looked different in his usual gray coat today. He placed the heavy box down near my station without making a sound. "These papers belong in the back room now," he said softly. His eyes stayed averted from me. The envelopes were yellowed at the edges with age. He had carried them across town through the damp wind. Those letters came from his father's old desk upstairs. Thomas had finally cleared out the drawer after 30 years of silence. I opened the cardboard box on the laminate table. The handwriting inside belonged to an older generation of men who trusted ink over computers. I read a single page about the winter of 1962. The tone was steady and entirely unremarkable. The ink was faded but legible under the fluorescent light. Arthur was gone from the building before noon arrived. No police sirens echoed through the empty downtown streets. The clinic ran smoothly under temporary management. I checked the supply log against the actual inventory on the shelves. Everything balanced correctly for the first time in 7 years. Vitals were recorded on time by the morning shift staff. The routine was simply a routine again, devoid of hidden ledgers or private panic. Thomas walked back toward the front door with slow steps. He paused by the glass panel for a brief moment. "I am taking a position at the county depot across town," he said. His voice carried no defensive edge anymore. I nodded and handed him a clean clipboard for his transit. He took it and stepped out into the gray street. His small redemption was complete without any applause. The remaining shift logs sat neatly inside the metal filing cabinet. I locked the bottom drawer and placed the key in my pocket. My nursing shift ended when the wall clock struck 3. I put on my jacket and grabbed the cardboard box of letters. Walking down Maple Street felt like any ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The cold air stung my cheeks as I crossed the pavement toward my front door. The safety deposit box receipt stayed hidden behind the kitchen calendar at home. I did not open it again that evening. I placed the letters on the wooden table next to a glass of water. Coldwater remained quiet beneath a gray sky that promised nothing unusual. The records were complete, and the work simply continued. A single lamp illuminated the corner of the small room. I left the box untouched on the shelf until morning. The town kept its own counsel about the change in management. People bought groceries and talked about the weather. Nobody asked me what was inside the safety deposit box. The past remained where the ledgers left it. There was nothing left to verify or correct before tomorrow. I turned off the kitchen light and sat down in the quiet kitchen. You might wonder why I simply walked away. Arthur is completely gone. Thomas found his own quiet path. For years, the blue folders and the carbon copies remained stored by me in a downtown vault, but proof only weighs you down if you refuse to set it free. I carried the heavy brown cardboard box back to Maple Street this morning. A quiet young nurse stood by the stainless steel counter. She was checking the morning shift schedule. I set the box right on the edge of the laminate surface. I pushed it forward until my fingertips cleared the cardboard completely. She looked down at the faded twine holding the old records together. I did not give her any warnings or advice. I just let the weight leave my hands entirely. You do not need to hold the past to know how the hours passed. The clock on the wall kept moving forward. I turned my back to the counter and walked out the front door into the bright spring afternoon daylight.